Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, our topic today is enterprise risk management. I actually believe they're the first one to come back a second year and talk about risk management and what we've improved on and done over the past year. Our process is that we'll introduce everybody, and then Jen and her team gets about 5 minutes to talk about some background, and then we turn it over for questions from the panel, and then we'll go to the audience if they have some questions, and then we'll turn it back to the board for questions. It's meant to be a dialogue, not a presentation. And so with that, I'm Leslie Vermillion, the Deputy County Administrator.
Suzanne Arnson, Child Welfare Manager. Cindy Geis, Property Customer Services Director.
Pam Selvig, Health and Human Services Director.
Jen Brigg-Wilson, Procurement Specialist.
Maria Heller, Contract Management Coordinator.
Kara Madsen, Volunteer and Community Coordinator.
Jeff Peichel, IT.
Steve Jones, Financial Analyst.
Jennifer Schultz, Enterprise Risk Manager.
Daniel Adams, Chief Financial Officer.
All right. Well, as Leslie said, this is actually our, we were here last June, and so this is our kind of our comeback. And just very quickly, last year we talked mostly about the framework of enterprise risk management. We talked about the methodology. We talked about what it looked like in theory. And some of the feedback that we got from that, that presentation is, then how do we, what does that look like in the day-to-day activities that we do? Enterprise risk management isn't intended to be a program. It really is again, a framework, a methodology of how we make decisions strategically, operationally, from a capital perspective. And it's really just making sure we have the right information and the leaders that make those decisions have the right information. And we've balanced that risk in those decisions. So, you know, really, the folks that are doing the day-to-day work, they're the ones out there encountering the risks that exists in everything we do every single day. So the decisions that they're making, those are really our biggest risks. So how we, one of the biggest, or the best things we can do from a mitigation standpoint is making sure we have good training in place, make sure we have good and strong policies in place. Again, if you recall last year, we had the picture, and it's in the packet, of the road analogy and how we talk about risk from every day I get on the road, we are making risk decisions. So if we can stay within that center line and that and the left lane there, we're doing pretty good. And that's if you think about it, that's what we do when we're training staff. Keep them between that center and the left side there to make sure they're making good decisions. Our policies and procedures really kind of align with that guardrail, and that should be our kind of that where we don't want to go past. We don't want to go over, we don't want to operate outside of those policies and those procedures that we have in place. So I think that analogy really helps kind of just steer us in that right direction. This year's presentation, we really focused on the day-to-day activities that we're doing from an OMB perspective. So that really includes day-to-day activities in the procurement, the contract area, finance. We've included IT this year as well, and ER, and also from our volunteer area too. So again, really with the feedback being, what are we doing day to day? And so that's where we wanted to put our focus this year, is just what our staff's doing day to day to make those good decisions, again, based on the policies and procedures we have in place.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, I'll turn it over to the panel.
Well, maybe I'll just start with a sort of a generally broader question in terms of, as you prepared, were there sort of key learnings that stuck out to you or surprises as you reviewed some of your data in preparation for today? And things that you were proud about, felt good about, or surprises, I guess?
That's a really good question. I think still to date, some of our information is really under construction, so we don't have a lot of data yet. I think, at least I can speak from the contract perspective, I was pleased to see that we are continuing to put more things that we're purchasing through a process, particularly from our higher, our bigger spend our CIP projects, knowing that those are going through, whether they're bid processes, RFP processes, they're getting in contracts. Those are all ways that we mitigate our risk to make sure that we're protected. So seeing that that's staying consistent or getting better. The other thing that I think that we looked at, and this was a new one this year, and looked at how much we're doing on cooperative purchasing ventures. So those could be state contracts, they could be national contracts that have already been written and vetted and are out there for us to use. And so at least the graph that's on page 13 shows that IT is one of our biggest users of those cooperative contracts. And so again, they're getting stuff, moving things, I think, more quickly and more efficiently because they can just access those and we're not having to take those higher things out for bid and RFP process, which slows down what Jeff and his staff need to do. And that's one area that I think we can see across the county. Other areas are using that some, but not to the same degree, and is there room for improvements there? So from a contract purchasing perspective, that's kind of some of the things that I looked at. I don't know if the panel, from their other perspectives, had any kind of lessons.
I think we're doing a lot with regard to risk. We're doing improvements in IT to focus on data security. We're doing training in ER. Finance and budget is all about risk management. That's why we have those processes and procedures in place. One of the big efforts is our policy updates for employee relations policies, finance policies, administrative policies, and going through those to talk about where are risks and where is the right place for risk. Because one of the balances when you talk about risk management is the more controls you place in an organization and on individuals, the less efficient they're going to be. I think we need to be a little bit more deliberate in talking about risk as we're having those conversations. We're thinking about it. You can tell in the room that we're thinking about it. It's talked about on specific risks, but having a more broad enterprise risk, how strict do we want to be with our policies versus how lenient in order to balance that efficiency and have a discussion on what is our risk tolerance a little bit more deliberately.
So on that same vein, one of the items that I was looking at as I was looking at more of just your cover and some of your background is that you seem to focus heavily on the training and the conversation. So along with that, knowing that we're a big organization, everybody does things a little bit differently, and to ensure that the managers, supervisors, and some of our key leaders are making the decisions that they need to and have all the data that they need to in order to advise or approve. One of the things that I was looking at is, do we have more of a risk plan, enterprise risk management plan, and in that identify things such as the considerations that everybody should consider as we're going forward with some major decision: technical, operational, regulatory, legal, political, strategic, and credit risk. So have you checked at all of these, and are they going to influence or cause some type of an impact to the organization? The other thing is, do we have any type of things to measure whether or not an overly burdensome policy is making us less efficient? So do we have those measurement tools to say, how do we measure our deviation from the standard? And then finally, do we have something that's overarching in our governance to say, when we're looking at risk, who are the players and what are their roles? Not to dismiss or excuse someone's ability to get in there and do the research that they need to. I know I talked to you specifically, Jen, in some of the contract, and when I go through contracts, I'm fine-lighting and highlighting and calling out different nuances that may cause us some risk if we don't identify them within the contract. But she said that's an anomaly. A lot of people don't go through that level of detail. So do we have more of an overarching plan that helps in all of these areas to make sure that we're making sound decisions?
So we do have the tools available to do a risk assessment throughout the organization. I do think we need to spend more time talking about what our overarching plan is. And I think that is, you use the correct term, the governance level. At what point and what level of risk tolerance do we say we need to do a full risk assessment on before this decision moves forward? And that's where I talk about we need to be more deliberate in our risk management and focusing on where is this level needed. There are a lot of risk management tools we already have in place. Having standard contracts that we use with vendors, having our processes and procedures kind of reduce that risk as we get lower into the organization. But we need to talk about what that right balance is where we go, no, we do need to do a full risk assessment versus, no, as long as we're training people to think about risk and looking at it from what is the risk here, that can go forward without having to do this overly cumbersome process. And I think that is a governance level discussion.
And I agree with Danny, and I think that that is one of our next steps that need to be had to figure that out. We have done a couple of bigger, larger kind of strategic risk assessments. We did that with the small cell tower, and then that eventually went into policy and ordinance, and took the time to kind of lay out what the risks, the impacts were to our operations, to our employees, to our citizens, to our finances, and then how vulnerable were we at each one of those levels. That's very time consuming. You have to have the right stakeholders in the room, and that isn't something we have the ability to do for every decision we make in the county. So it's really deciding at what level does that need to happen, and then what level are the day-to-day decisions just happening. You know, Pam and Suzanne, their staff are making risk decisions every single day when it comes to child protection, for example. Our sheriff's office are making risk decisions every single day. That's just embedded in the day-to-day. And that being really through that training and that policy. So that is really, Cindy, a great question. I think it's really our next step that we have to decide from our organization, what does that look like? And that involves conversations with our leadership and with our board. At what level does that need to occur?
Yeah, I think the ordinance for small cell was a very good one because it ended up going into an ordinance. And that really brought the perspective in of potentially the importance to the residents and our citizens. So it twisted the discussion some from managing right-of-way to what was the benefit as well of that right-of-way. And so that was a really good part of it. The PCI one, I don't think we completed out, but we'd started it. And so I think that's another one that if we finished it would probably help with some of those types of discussions.
I agree with you, Leslie, and I think what we did learn from the PCI and where Jeff has been able to take that is a lot of what needed to occur from PCI was training and policy in our action items. That was identified in almost every single areas that we needed better training and we needed better policy. So I think some of those areas Jeff's been able to take and kind of lead forward.
And it wasn't training in IT, it was training in other departments and divisions on how we need to handle it, and impacted far. It was bigger than an IT issue.
It was much bigger than an IT issue, yeah, absolutely.
I had similar questions to Cindy, but maybe just a little bit different bend. So on page 4, you talk about a lot of the challenges with implementing an enterprise risk management. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what steps are being taken to bring that discussion to departments?
So that's another really good question, and again, I think that is also another next step. I think just more in our day-to-day things that's coming to departments, some of the activities Jeff's doing from a security perspective, what we're doing in contracts and purchases. But in terms of determining from that governance perspective, what level of risk assessment really needs to be done, needs to occur before we can determine what needs to come to the department level, specifically around how much assessment. So I think, again, those are some of our next steps, and we're trying to figure this out as we go. One of the challenges with enterprise risk management is and again, this is something I spoke about last year, was it is an area that is developed more in the private sector and has yet to be developed in the public sector. Although we are seeing movement in that area. I have, since our presentation last year, I know Ramsey County and Hennepin County have each hired enterprise risk managers. Dakota just recently reached out to me about hiring enterprise risk manager. So counties are starting to think about that and what that means at a different level than what previously had happened. So I think, Pam, that just to, again, reiterate, we have to figure out at what level it needs to come out to the businesses. And it certainly isn't to we certainly need to balance that with it isn't for us to come in and say, you guys know your business, and it's to learn from one another and talk and be able to have the conversation around it, I think, more importantly than coming in and saying folks aren't doing things correctly. So,
And we're going to be coming in, hopefully the next couple of months, with a proposed structure to a cabinet discussion to talk about, this is how we would see this being implemented. I mean, having that discussion about what the right level down is, and then making sure those people who should be involved in that discussion are trained on how to do the risk management process so that they can evaluate it, start identifying, okay, if we're going to do this, who are the right people to be in the room in order to do that risk analysis.
So I'm kind of curious then, kind of along that line. So on page 9 at the very bottom, you talk about some formal risk assessments have been completed, and it sounds like you talked about a couple IT things that have happened. You know our world. What would that look like in HHS?
That's, again, another really good question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for it, but I think it may be around more strategic decisions that you're making at an upper level. If you're looking at changing a program or completely how you do business, it might be having some of those conversations there. I don't necessarily see it in your day-to-day, but I see it more at that higher level if you're looking at, again, completely changing how you do business or how you're doing a program. I'm speaking very generally. But that's where I really see, or we're bringing a major decision to the board about a funding piece, for example, where it maybe isn't only the impact about dollars, but how does that impact our staff? How does that impact our decision? That's where I see we would really look to be doing more of those kind of larger formal kind of assessments than more in the day-to-day where people are making those quick decisions. And that's really, again, back to the day-to-day, that's really where the good training and the policy comes into play. And again, kind of reserving those more larger assessments at that higher level decision-making.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of departments that follow state standards, state specifications, and when you're doing that, it's already mitigated some of the risk. And then it's a variance decision, which somebody on a licensure usually has to make, or it has to come to the board to vary from. And so some of that is built into some of the programs on a day-to-day already.
Right, so it really kind of, when you're looking at those decisions where we made, if we just look at it at first glance, it really appears to maybe be a financial decision. But then if we think about it, we're adding a staff, for example, we're adding multiple staff. What does that do to our operations? What does that do to our other employees? So there's always those other areas that may be impacted more than it's just a financial decision. So it's really getting folks to look beyond that kind of first glance.
I do think on 13 you need to look at that one though, because my understanding of some of those, like vehicles, Jen, salt, even like our Silco crack seal,
Yep.
those are done off cooperative contracts, and
They
that's
are.
not reflected there. So we need to take a look at that graph.
And I think you're right, Leslie, because when I was looking at that too, particularly in the area of community services, that's where I would see another area where I believe we're doing quite a bit off of the state contracting. And I'm not sure where that's captured in our data, and I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, I don't believe it is. So it would
Yeah.
show up under TS or CS, however we break it out. But
Yeah.
I know those things are done off of, I can ask Troy, but off state
Right.
contracts and bids and, or we use partnering, Cindy did e-poll books went off of Hennepin. So I mean, I think we need
Correct.
to help you there, make sure you have the right data as well.
And again, this was this was a new measure for us, and so I agree with you, Leslie. I think I'm not sure we've captured that.
So that process, we need to
Completely.
figure it out.
Yep.
I have a question on that same graph. I mean, it shows us the dollars that we spend, but it just shows us a figure, and it doesn't really tell us anything. So whether we spent it on cooperative purchasing or whether we spent it through the RFP process and we really selected our own vendors, do we know what the cost benefit is by going through the cooperative purchasing route rather than going off on our own? Sometimes it may not always be the best avenue to take, particularly if you have a little bit of different deviation on how we're structured. We do things a little differently sometimes when it's appropriate. But it would be nice to see this graph changed a little bit to say, we decided to go through the cooperative purchasing on this project. However, this is what it would have cost us, or this is the amount of time we would have spent in going through the RFP. And we know that that process is extremely long based upon some of the other graphs that you've indicated within this packet. So, time is money as well. So just to consider that as people are going through those decision makings, to say, could you provide us a little bit better detail? So we'd say, this is what it would have been, this is what it was, more of a cost benefit to the taxpayer.
And I think that's a great suggestion for us to be able to add to that, because even in the background, I had made a statement about it doesn't always make the most sense to go off a cooperative, exactly for what you cited. Sometimes, if we're going off a cooperative, we may have a deviation. We might not be just like what that state contract is. There may be reasons we want to include other vendors for whatever, for a variety of reasons. So in some of those situations, it makes more sense that we would go out for an RFP or a bid. I think, and I think we can probably try to show this and do this with some of our capturing from our time cards, how much time we're spending when we do an RFP or if we do a bid, and then comparing that to if we didn't, what that would look like. But that might be one way to enhance this measure, is looking at how much time we're spending, because that's really, off the top of my head, our biggest savings with our cooperative contracts, because anybody that's participated in an RFP process knows that it's not unlikely that there's 5 or 6 or 7 staff people dedicating a significant amount of time to putting that RFP together, to evaluating that RFP, to making, bringing vendors in. So I think we can maybe capture some of that through some of that time entry.
So have you identified some of those bottlenecks? I think I know where one of them is from a frustration standpoint for staff. And then as we're talking about the policy, the board's granted us certain thresholds, but to streamline $900 purchases or $1,000 purchases, how do we educate even on that, maybe staff, that is at something at all level where there's very minimal risk that would speed that up and not take the attorney's time or something like that? So where are you headed with that?
Well, I think, this is, and I've worked over the last few years trying to make some efficiencies in that areas by putting templates in place, putting some of those purchases on purchase orders versus putting them on contracts that really don't require a contract. So trying to kind of put some of those things in what I would call as buckets, although those buckets don't always look so nice and neat, and we kind of have to sometimes take them on a case-by-case basis. But trying to really look at those, what I would say in a contract or a purchasing world, cost doesn't equate to risk. So we could have a very low cost contract and it still could be a pretty high risk. Some of the things, one of the things that we're always looking at, like in Jeff's area, when he's doing a contract, what access does that vendor potentially have to confidential information? Because even though we may be only bringing the consultant in for a few $1,000s, right? If they have access to our confidential information and that's breached, that could be a $1 million risk plus to the organization. So could be a low contract, high risk. And it could be it could be completely opposite. We could have a multi-million-dollar contract and it's pretty low risk because of how prescribed things are and how specific the state and the federal government requires us to do things. So it is really, Leslie, balancing that and getting folks in our organization to realize that the dollar amount isn't what really equals the risk piece of it. And then putting those templates in place and having those conversations with our departments to try to help streamline.
In addition to that, I've been working diligently with the facilities department too. When they have 1 or 2 week projects that they want to do, but they don't want to have to go through the whole contract process, we've been working with them, just putting things on a purchase order, but also pulling things out of our contracts with our general standard terms and conditions and putting those things into the purchase order as well, such as our insurance and workers' comp and so forth. So that has been saving some time going forward, going through the review process by the county attorney. That's been really great to work with as well.
Yeah, I think that's something we're doing on a day-to-day basis, is trying to problem solve with departments about how to make things go quicker, because if we looked at our numbers in terms of how much we're purchasing in contracts hasn't gone down in this organization, it continues to go up. Yet our number of staff and resources to review contracts and stuff hasn't increased with the volume. So we always have to look at ways of continuing to make that process move as quickly as we can. Because on the other side, sorry, now I'm on my soapbox, but the other side is if we don't have those contracts in place, then we put our organization at risk if folks just then go, I'm going to do it anyway because I got to get this moving, right? That's the flip side to it that we don't want to occur either.
Jen or someone, can you talk about page 11 a little bit, that chart? I've spent a little time looking at that, and so I might be a little slow here. It took me a long time to even figure out kind of what this was, but help me kind of understand. So we're looking at the percent of spending that we're using contracts or purchase orders through.
Correct.
And from an operational standpoint in particular, I'm just kind of wondering, what does that mean and where do you gather that from? And kind of what's the value of this chart to you?
So again, I would say I will start with the value of it to us is looking at, so outside of our salaries, which of course is county's biggest spend, and some of the regular stuff, when we're spending things on contracts and purchasing, the stuff that we need to run the organization, as much of that goes through some kind of a process to make sure that it's going through a solicitation process or it's in contract and we have agreements in place that says you're going to do this and we're going to pay you that, or vice versa to mitigate that risk, is ideal. So we want those outside at those thresholds, those dollar thresholds. We want those things in contracts or in purchase orders, or we want some kind of legal document that says what's the relationship between us and the vendor. So that's the dollars that we're looking at in this chart. So when I look at this, Pam, operational, so our biggest spend obviously is in the capital area, and and in the transportation area. We're doing a pretty decent job of making sure all that stuff is in contracts or it's in purchase orders. Not perfect, but we're doing a pretty decent job and have consistently done that. On the operations side, that is relatively low because those are our lower spends, and much of our lower spends, we've strategically pushed those to P cards so that we are not taking the time to cut checks for $200 items and $300 items. We're just putting those on P cards and moving those through. So, and again, that's an efficiency piece. So I think that's why we see the lower on the operation side, because it's not as much the bigger items. And what we are still seeing there on the operation would be the contracts, some of the contracts that we have for you that come out of your operations. That stuff's reflecting, but not your lower type of purchases aren't reflecting on this graph.
But do we have a sense on what that even should be? Because if you look at our operations, about 70% is staffing, so across the county. So, I mean, what does that at 16%, what does that tell us?
Do you know the numbers, Steve, when you pulled this?
I do not recall at all. But within these numbers, though, staffing has been excluded.
Right.
So of that 16%, it's of the total discretionary expenditures.
Oh, okay.
So,
Discretionary, yeah.
So it's small equipment, it's purchases we need to make for things that we use to operate,
Correct.
It's not,
Office supplies.
it's not things
It's
that we do
office
for
supply,
staffing,
yeah.
yeah.
But even that wouldn't be in there because all of that stuff a lot of that's on P cards. A lot of those discretionary at the operating level are occurring on P cards and not on a purchase order or on a contract by design.
But with that, were there items that were discovered that really should have been moved? I guess these are just numbers.
Yep.
But are they right? Are they wrong? Are there like anomalies where, well, we put this on a purchase order, but we really should have put it on a P card or vice versa, or we should have had a contract, but it wasn't?
Yeah.
I guess those are the kind of questions that I would have is, it's here, but is it right? Or are there things that we found out through this graph that we would like to change or set some standards for so that people are doing it the way that we want it to be and it's consistent?
Yep, and again, and I think that's great feedback and another great point, Cindy. We could probably work on this to provide more of the story. I think more of the story is this: yes, every day we find things that we go, oh, we could have purchased that on a P card. We shouldn't have necessarily taken the time and energy to cut a check for that. Could have just gone on a P card. Or, yep, this is something that really should have gone on a contract. And those are the day-to-day education pieces that we're doing ongoing with staff and calling departments and kind of talking through those things. But this, you're right, this doesn't necessarily tell that story of then what maybe we could have done differently to make sure that we were, it was in the process that we wanted it to be in, whether it was a contract or a purchase order, or really should have been on that P card.
The other way to look at this is the percentage of things that aren't going through a purchase order or a contract, which means that it's being followed using our county policies. And so those policies, then, we have to make sure they're good enough to provide the boundaries of where people should be making decisions. And that's where we see that there's efficiency there. Between the CIP and TIP, those are a lot bigger dollar amounts, so there's probably fewer decisions. But this, 84%, there's a lot of decision-making going on by our employees in doing purchases, and that's where we have to make sure they're trained on our policies and how we have to implement that, and that our policies are effective.
And some of these, I believe this percentage could probably be higher because we have standard expenditures that we make during the year. So for our operations, it's probably around 30 million when I think about it now that we're looking at for total dollars spent. Some of it's going to be software maintenance agreements, hosting agreements, that up front you're looking at the contract, but then each year you're not reviewing it because it's still part of that standard contract, but on an annual basis we're making payments. So we probably could adjust a little bit.
Adjust that as well.
And my guess is, and I don't know, Steve, where you pulled the dollars on the tip, but if right-of-way is a portion of that 20% expenditure, those do go through kind of a contracted process. The board authorizes, they enter into a contract for that settlement. But it's a different contract process than you would have for going out for bid or those types of things.
Correct.
So even that itself is based on board authorization and then settlement through a process. If those are, I'm just guessing, looking at this, could be part of what it is.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking like our Three Rivers agreement that we have with parks.
Correct.
We really go through that contract, but again, it's not on an annual basis.
So I think the process for the data and how we get at it is a really good discussion as part of what's coming out of this.
Yep.
Because when I think of a lot of our operations expenses, we do have some contracts, of course, but a lot of it is to out-of-home placement and that kind of thing. So so it's just hard for me to understand what that's telling us on an operations piece, because those aren't things that we'd have contracts for.
That's great feedback.
So one of the things we talked about was time. So in 14, do you have a feel for that spike in the red? The trend there, what is that telling you?
Off the top of my head, it tells me we had a couple of pretty complicated RFPs in 17 that took a lot of time, took a lot of staff time across the board from different departments, and that's really, that's probably 2 or 3 that are really making that spike. What it also, though, tells me is that time we take to make sure our requirements are right, to make sure we get that drafted, to make sure it is a very, very time-consuming process. And the staff that have participated in that, I think, understand that and see that. And I think that continues to be an area where we have to continue to work on efficiencies to keep things moving. Again, those are a couple of pretty complicated IT projects, software purchases that we made that occurred in 17.
I had a question about, I had Leslie's question, but then the other thing that surprised me about this graph was the low numbers. Okay, I can't remember back to 16, but 17, and I just want to make sure I'm thinking of the right things. I think of things like new options, our crisis contract. We contracted for case management. So that would be 3 of the 5.
Yeah.
So am I not thinking of the right things that are in that 5?
I didn't have the ones behind me. Jen, do you remember do you have the?
We did 3 bids in 2017 as well, along with the new options and the crisis RFP.
I was going to say, some of those are in there, Pam.
Okay.
The
Yeah,
case management was 2016.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, time flies.
Yeah, and then some other ones too that I believe are from the IT, but yeah, some of those would be those ones that you
Okay.
identified.
I'm surprised by the small number across the county.
Of the,
That there's even that many, there's so few that were going out, but.
and again, so I think this is a data problem we probably have because we do have decentralized purchasing as well, so we're not capturing everything that's happening in the county and don't have a good way to do that. So other departments might be doing RFPs and those things as well, and we don't necessarily have that data. These are the ones that we have eyes into, access to, that we're capturing in here. So I think, again, the kind of overarching how we're collecting this data is a bit challenging with how we're set up.
Do you have like targets or benchmarks in terms of where you would like to see your performance?
Another really great question. I don't think I have an answer for that, but that would be really good just to kind of look from a statewide, nationwide, perspective. That I'm sure there's benchmarks out there and some where we would like to be. I would say off the top of my head again, we always want to be lower than what we are because of all the feedback I get, it's this takes too long, and how can we speed this up, and how can we keep this moving along? So that's always one that we're looking at, and we'll say I think there's ways we can, and then there's ways that we really don't have control over, and what we don't have control over is people's schedules and the amount of people that these processes take to make sure we're making good, solid decisions. So those are some of the things that we really continue to struggle with. But certainly taking that as a note, Suzanne, I think that's a great point.
To kind of piggyback on the conversation on this graphic, do we know, so we know that the difference, of course, between 16 and 17 is dramatic, and you would kind of explain why, but there was some inference such as detailed requirements gathering is really important, and making sure that you're structuring your RFP in an appropriate manner in order to mitigate some of these back and forths maybe is appropriate. So do we have a laundry list at all of some lessons learned that maybe, yeah, the RFP wasn't written quite right. There were some major gaps in it, and it wouldn't just affect that department, but it could affect all departments. And so would there be some structured training, such as how to write a correct RFP, making sure that you have your T's crossed, your I's dotted, and making sure you're not missing anything so that we can bring the time necessary to get one of these implemented and executed down?
Another really good point. And yes, I think we do have lessons learned and have continued to add to that. And as a result, have tweaked templates. We now have we have RFP templates in place, things that we know are required in every RFP. We have, this year, we've really focused on scoring and having scoring templates in place to create some consistency across that. We now have our spreadsheets and has made that process of scoring, I think, a lot easier. But what our next step is definitely getting that information then out to the folks that are in the departments that are doing RFPs and providing them that training. It's happening, I would say, probably ad hocly. People are calling, we're giving them that information, but some kind of a formal training or kind of having how to write an RFP training, how to draft a contract training, those pieces we haven't yet formalized. But that maybe is a really good next step on the things that you have to have in it to make sure we can move things in a quicker.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some also challenges that we kind of incur on a regular basis too. It may not just reflect 16 or 17, but there's times when we're brought into the project in the middle of the project, and then we don't know where they are. We have a lot of information that we need to learn maybe about the department or the project, so then we kind of maybe had to take 5 steps backwards and kind of go back and start from the beginning versus when we're brought into the project at the beginning of it, or maybe have that upfront learning right away. So that could also increase the time being spent on these projects just from an informational and understanding of the services or the purchases that we're making, just because, you know, facilities or IT or, you know, fleet may not be our top, you know, what we know, our knowledge base. But it's a great way to learn more about the county, but I think that could be also a challenge for us as well.
So I think some of the processes that the EBT department has started to put in place in terms of the requirements up front and getting things, I mean, our process flows right from that. And those two go hand in hand of getting that information and those requirements on that up front. We then can write a better solicitation, and ultimately that becomes a better contract.
So did that answer it, Sin?
Sure.
So on page 20, loss control, where do you want to go with that one? I'm surprised you don't have any data in there when I looked at, you know, motor vehicle claims and property damage and things like that. So where do you intend to go with that one moving forward?
So I think we have data. I don't have data for the presentation. Within the last, one of the changes or the shifts that we're making from an organization is insurance claims, lawsuits. So insurance, except for workers' comp, is being transitioned to the enterprise risk management area that was previously in employee relations. So, so activities around the loss control. Again, off the top of my head, that's insurance. Those are claims. Those are lawsuits. So, couple of things that I think we will look in the next year to pull data around is just, again, and we have to think through this a little bit more, but off the top of my head, costs of accidents and incidents, what the different types that we have. We have a variety of different kind of incidences that occur on an ongoing basis. So looking at that from a cost perspective, and then also looking at the different types of exposures from a county perspective. We do have the annual MCT comes in and does the annual audit. I think that would be a place to start to be able to start pulling some of that information, looking at what exposures we have, and then looking at how what are our strategies to mitigate those exposures that we identified. You know, our staff identifies those exposures as well. So I think there's a few ways that we could kind of start looking, but that's from an initial perspective where I think we'd like to have some data next year to be able to present or when we come back. And then just kind of, again, comparing the types of incidences that are happening. So again, to provide us information about where we should put our mitigation efforts. So if that's vehicle incidents, for example, or if it slips and falls, or whatever types of incidents those are, we're looking at where we can focus our energy. So Leslie, off the top of my head, that's kind of where I would think we would start. And then the other thing that I know Jen has done a little bit of is just kind of working with MCIT and even asking them from their perspective, from their expertise, what would make sense for some measurements and places to go, and how they've seen other organizations do performance measurements around loss control.
Thank you.
I'll switch gears a minute. I'm going to pick on Kara a little bit. Just that, first of all, on page 16, I just wanted to congratulate you. Kind of way to go. Volunteer hours, huge increase from 16 to 17. Kind of what do you attribute that to?
Better tracking of the system.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, we have brought on a lot of new volunteers in a lot of areas, so we've kind of expanded the volunteering throughout the county. And so we are bringing on other volunteers to other departments in other areas, but a better tracking system now to really be able to gather those hours.
All right. And then in follow-up on page 17, well, first of all, on page 3, you talk about, page 3 references volunteers have been primarily in HHS. But as I look at the graph in 17, or on page 17, I don't even see, well, I see part of HHS because public health is there in the JAF, but I know there's been other volunteers, so kind of.
Yeah, it's again how we're gathering the information now and we're tracking the information. We've always had sheriff reserves who are volunteers, so we're now able to capture that information a little bit more. Health and Human Services was an area that our previous volunteer coordinator came from, and so that was kind of the area that she really focused on. So as we're expanding and as we're putting volunteers into other areas and really working with other divisions, such as the sheriff office, to really gather those hours, that's kind of where it's coming from.
But we aren't even listed there then, so not at all anymore?
You have a handful of them,
okay.
So it's basically, I mean, for the most part, those are kind of our onesie-twosies. So it's a mentor, so those are ongoing volunteers, but it's maybe somebody who is shoveling a driveway or maintenance for an elderly person, things like that. So, yeah, unfortunately, we just didn't capture it in there, but you do still have many volunteers.
Okay. Do you have ideas or strategies that might sort of help bolster the use of the volunteer mentors within HHS?
Again, it's probably, reaching out and working with them. We have a lot of new staff that have come in, so a lot of them don't even know that there are volunteer opportunities. There's other areas that they're driven to. A lot of times when I see maybe a post on fish, I'll reach out to them right away and say, I can grab a volunteer for you. They would either go to fish, which is a real quick, convenient way for them to do, post a need, or a lot of them tell me that they go to Lutheran Social Services. So I think it's just a matter of educating Health and Human Service Division, and especially those new ones there that we do have the opportunity, here within our volunteer database.
Yeah, I think that was part of our discussion last year, was things like Adopt a Highway and libraries didn't even show up, and we knew they had huge volunteer hours.
Yep. Yep, so we're trying to capture more of that.
And the reason this measure's in here is because we are trying to do a better job of tracking this, because there are insurance implications, there are safety and training implications for these volunteers, and that's one of the biggest drivers of the numbers, is that we've started to get a handle on where they're all coming from. So if you have volunteers that don't think we're tracking, please let us know so we can make sure that Kara has them.
And I think that's one of the biggest areas that we've improved this year, is us having that conversation about the different types. And because different types of mentors pose different types of risk to the county, and again, they're not all equal depending on what they're doing, at what level they're volunteering for the county. So considering that and talking about that and understanding that has been something that we have started to work more closely with Kara on as well. So I think that's a big improvement that we've made in the last year.
Another way to get, I think, some information out on the volunteer services and some opportunities for people who may not be aware is to change this grid up a little bit, or have an additional grid. Well, first of all, I love this grid. I think it's great. It would be nice to see what are the unmet hours, who are we looking for, and why can't we find them? But the other one is to turn around with these numbers and say, okay, we have 34,179 hours. If you could kind of pigeon them into buckets such as, this is for office assistants, this is for out in the community helping the underserved or underpopulated, or whatever they're doing, kind of pick your buckets to say, what are these people doing, and where is there still a need? Because maybe I have a skill set, well, I don't have a skill set, but if I did.
That's true.
I'm just saying, if I did, looking at this from the outside perspective, people are like, what does the county do? I know my city, or I know this, I know somebody that's real local, but the county is this overarching waste of time. But no, there's a lot of things we do, and how can we make sure that the public knows all these little opportunities for them to be involved and part of our family here at Scott County? So that would be nice to see as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to commend you for that one. I thought when we talked about wins, this was a big change, because we talked about risk of volunteers and who they're with, and we were going to track that, and you just see a much more increase in where you are. I think that was a real win.
Great, thank you.
The audience, you guys, any more questions? All right, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Judith, imagine.
It only took me 3 hours to get here. I at least have to say something. This is more a comment or a suggestion as you move forward. I know that you're fairly new into a lot of these measures, and most of them, as I look at them, are kind of telling what you're doing or how much you're doing, and so it's more an external demonstration of what you are involved in, as opposed to the kinds of measures at this point that would help you manage your program. And so going back to one of the ones that there were a number of questions on, and that was the percent of spend on contracts, where people were asking, so what does this really mean? I think if you take the time to go back and decide where you should be. So for example, on the one where you're 16%, is that the right place? So instead of now spending a lot of time, as it sounds like you're doing, looking at are these the right ones or the wrong ones? If you decide 16% is really the amount of that should be on contracts, then you just monitor that. And you say, we're doing okay. If you drop below that, that's when you take the time to look and see what's going on. But so long as you don't have those targets, then it's just a display of this is how much we're doing. And so the next step really is what should you be doing and are we meeting that? Suggestion.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
I was looking at this with a lot of interest. I know that one of the things we've been trying to focus on is getting our operations folks to do a better job of getting quotes and stuff. But I'm surprised at how low, and I'm assuming that operations is kind of across the board, but how low operations is, because a number of the items that we do, like pavement marking, seal coating, salt, purchase of salt and chemicals, a lot of those are done through contracting and through joint venture contracting that we do with other agencies. So I'm kind of questioning if some of that's been captured in this this chart. And we certainly would like to sit down and talk about what the data is showing from our perspective as well.
Thank you. I think that's great feedback too. And I do think how we're capturing this is a challenge. So that will also be a takeaway, I think, in this next year about how we're gathering that data. We don't have a real good system to be able to do that. A lot of it's manual. And if there's a way we can maybe automate that a little bit more. So that's great feedback. Thank you.
So I got a general question about the risk. So we often associate risk with something negative impact. Do we have measure in place where we are monitoring and mitigating the risks which are good?
Can you explain what you mean a little bit more by the risks that are good?
Yeah, definitely. So if I were working on a project and have extra funding available, what should I do with that? I mean, I can go out and spend and get additional functionality, which was not part of the original scope of the project, and how is going to impact my project based on the quality schedule and timelines and whatnot. So that's what I mean by a goods risk. Or maybe I have a project team. Initially, I thought it was going to take me 2 people to do it, and then I got 4 people, which never happens. So that's another example of a good risk. What should I do with the 2 extra people on my project?
So I think what you're talking about is risk versus efficiency. So when that project was being designed, we may have overcompensated for how much risk and put so much structure and parameters and timeline in that we worked out some efficiency, and so now your staff is tied up in this and we have available staff time. So I would say that's more of an efficiency that was gained, or that you have out of that can be applied elsewhere. But that's the discussion, is how much do we put these parameters and oversight to try and mitigate risk, and what's the impact on our organizational efficiency that now, instead of those resources being available somewhere else, they've been tied up into this program, and we either have to find work for them, and it's not a bad thing to have staff with time to be able to work on other projects and resources, but we didn't have an opportunity to proactively plan that and prioritize that, and now it rolls into either the next year or the next month, or maybe we're filling time with projects that are lower priority because we didn't actively have that planned ahead of time. So that's that risk versus efficiency balance that we're trying to achieve.
And to answer your question, I don't think we currently don't have a good way to measure that. We even struggled, one of the things that we're trying to get some information on is, on the flip side of that, are our projects, our contracts on time and on budget? Because when they're not, and we are in the middle of a project, for example, and we suddenly don't have enough people, or we have a change order, and if we're kind of faced with the, well, if we don't do it, the project doesn't continue, and we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. We've thought about trying to measure that too. It's just how do we collect that data? Because we don't want to be in that position either, where again, you're in the middle of a project, and you're really kind of faced with the, well, what do you do? Well, we kind of have to accept this change order if we want to move it forward. And again, some of that is to the front end. How well did we do on the front end of the managing the risk and the efficiencies, as Danny was talking about. But again, if the question is, do we have a good way of measuring it? I would say currently we do not have a good way to measure it, but I think it's something that we should probably as an organization talk about how we potentially could.
But there are instances where we are looking at it though. And I believe slide 7, looking at retiree health insurance, that is one where we looked at risk more from a benefit perspective. And what we're doing here is we're setting aside funds into a trust, and we're really using the trust itself with investment earnings to help get more funding to meet our liability. So we could have just stayed as we were going back in 2009 and really waited until we had these benefits come to us and spent money from the levy. But instead what we did is we started setting funds aside into our trust so that investment earnings can help capture some of those increased costs that we'll see. And now we have our benefits funded at 77%, of which the county's contributed $9.6 million, but our investment earnings, knock on wood that they continue going well, is at $8 million. So right there, it's really benefited our taxpayers that the more we can earn outside of our taxpayers, it's a benefit to all. So we do have instances where we are looking at positive risk that way.
Imran, I just really like the fact that you spun that risk isn't always negative. And that was part of, I think, the message last year, that risk is, again, really kind of thought of, is it something bad, it's negative. And the reality is, and part of this message is, no, it exists in everything we do. The minute I get out of bed in the morning, I'm assuming some level of risk. We all are. And so along with risk become opportunities. And that's where the organization really making those decisions about what is that level of risk we're willing to accept, and that opportunity that might be there by accepting some of that risk. So thank you for pointing out that it isn't always something that is bad, because again, unfortunately, I think it's kind of gotten a bad name, that the risk is the showstopper, and it shouldn't be the showstopper. It should be the discussion and the information to make those really good, sound decisions.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, with the volunteers, are those volunteers, do some of them volunteer drive and some of them work with Human Services? Are they the same volunteers?
Yeah, they can
Or
be.
do they typically do multiple types of volunteering?
Yep, I do have a handful that do multiple volunteer opportunities, so,
Okay.
yep.
Great. And then I was thinking about accidents, and I don't know how you record accidents. I know that there's accident report forms that people fill out. But I wondered if you did any kind of measurements on the type of accidents that we have and what kind of training we have to prevent some of those. And if you could measure the type of accidents that occur within the county, like with the vehicles. So oftentimes we find out things come in damaged that haven't been reported. So I'm wondering, number one, how do we get those reported? And number two, how can we measure those? I don't know if that's related to some of this stuff, or Judith is probably saying that's not the right kind of measurement, but I think it is. And then I was wondering too, like, you guys have been doing a great job with the contracts. I've seen major improvements in how we go through the process and the timing and all that. It's been really good. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you tie back specifically to risk, the things that you measure in your contracts. So for example, you know, if you have, that you're measuring, like, I think with some of the IT contracts or even the transit contract that's out today that we did the RFP on, some of the things that we look for that we didn't look for in the past, if you could somehow measure those to see how you're doing in your improvements. So to his point, some of the good things you're doing that are in there that probably aren't being measured today.
I think that's a great point, Troy, because off the top of my head, I know one completely shift of what we've done in terms, and I already mentioned it this morning, but one that I'm thinking of very differently than I did in the past is data breaches and the information that any of our vendors may get. And I think just again, just because of how much that's changed, but that is something that I look at completely different now with contracts than I had previously because of the more information that we got, and we're talking about that differently, we're weighing that differently. So again, just off the top of my head, that's one. But great suggestion about, is there a way that we could measure some of those pieces? Again, that's Judith, maybe she can help us figure out how we might measure that. And this challenge is then how do we get the data? But I certainly know we have examples of how we look at things differently than even that I looked at it 10 years ago.
And to your point on vehicles that get in accidents, we either need to look at, we have a policy issue where we're not requiring people to report it, or we have a training issue where employees haven't been trained on, if this happens, this is what you need to do. Or we have an enforcement issue of someone's not doing this and we need to hold them accountable for, if you get in an accident, these are the things you have to do. And with regards to the data, we should be able to get something out of that, and that's what we're talking about with MCIT, helping us to capture that. What are we seeing, and do we need to apply more training in certain areas?
Troy, I think the data's there. I just don't think that was back to the loss. I don't think we've just accumulated and put it in, but part of the driving training people do is how to report, and you have kits in every vehicle. So I know that we do talk about it with folks. It's reporting back then broader on what they found. Usually that report, doesn't it, Rhonda, just go back to the person kind of that was involved with it, right? Preventive, this is what you could have done differently, some of it, or to the manager.
It goes back to the department as well, or to the supervisors as well. But we do have a lot of old data, you know, from accidents and incidents and all that kind of stuff, but not a really good way to track it and put it into the performance measures. But we have looked at it all along. I can tell you, just in the last few weeks, we've had 3 backing accidents from the sheriff's department. And so it's obviously a training issue. We have something going on here, and so we're already taking a look at that. So there's still going to be some crossover here because we're keeping safety in employee relations. And so there's going to be some crossover here between what we do with safety issues and training and things that go along with safety, and how that rolls over into the tracking that they're going to be doing with the loss control part of it, with the claims and everything.
And my point was to, you know, so if you have multiple backing accidents, for example, in a year's time, if you can improve on that. So if you know how many lane change accidents you've had versus backing accidents versus hitting fixed objects, those kinds of things, if you track them, and you can see improvements done over time.
Anything else from the audience? So if you could have just a couple things you'd change for next year, what would they be?
Well, I think, again, I just want to thank everybody for their suggestions and participation. I mean, I'm really thinking about a couple of things that you all said about, and what's really is the benchmarking piece of it. We haven't done that, so I can't answer those questions, but that's one of the first things I feel like I want to go back and take a look at and see where we have the data of where we're at, but I don't know if that's necessarily where we're supposed to be at. So thank you for offering that. So I would like to take a look at that. The other piece that this team has talked about, and we've already got meetings scheduled already in July to start preparing and thinking about how we move forward. And the one piece to that is then how do we get out to the other departments? We're really focused on OMB this year because it was just an easy place to focus on our day-to-day activities, but what does that mean with Pam's area, for example, and Cindy's area, and transportation and community services and what other folks are doing on a day-to-day basis with risk, and being able to address some of those questions, really good questions that you guys asked about what is that higher level, what is that just day-to-day piece, and really kind of diving in and taking a look at that. And then ultimately at that governance level too. Where does the organization want to be, and what kind of level of risk are we comfortable with? So those, off the top of my head, would be where I would like to see this move forward in the next year to 2 years.
Mr. Chairman?
Okay. Any other, Commissioner Brackey.
I have a few comments. First, I just want to thank you and acknowledge that I think, at least this is my feeling, is that it's probably harder to come back after your initial presentation than prepare for the first presentation. You prepare for the first presentation, you get all that data, you say, here's what we need to do, and then all of a sudden, and let's be fair to you guys, it's only been 11 months, all of a sudden 11 months have went by and you're like, what? Wow, we've barely been able to address those because day-to-day life gets in the way. So thank you, and I understand it is more difficult the second time. These are just comments, I think, but they're probably a little bit of assumptions for me, and so correct me if I'm wrong. But one thing that, and I'm really happy, and this was my comment last year, and I hope this team can really take it to heart, is getting this out to the departments. And I understand that there's a lot of thought and planning that needs to go into that, but maybe that's a later message. I think right now you're ready to get the first message out, that every employee needs to think a little bit about the risks they take in everyday decision making and think about it from that standpoint. I know a lot of our really good employees, and you know, Andy, who's a new employee who's here this morning, he's going to fix a squad car and he's going to fix it right, but he's thinking about how to fix it and what part. He's not thinking about why it's so important that it's done this way or that way. It's not always evident why it's so important that if I'm driving a county vehicle, I don't do this thing or that thing, just because it's not nice or polite, but no, because it can cost the taxpayers a lot of money. And I think that resonates with our employees. They understand that because they're taxpayers, but it also can help frontline workers explain why we do things the way we do to citizens and constituents and people they interact with every day. Frontline workers are faced with tough situations with the folks they interact with, and being able to say, gosh, I understand your situation is tough. I understand you want your ditch cleaned out. But if we do this for every private ditch, we're going to have to raise taxes 82%. And we got to make sure that this is an issue that we have the obligation to do. It needs to be part of all of our conversations, and maybe it'll make our job easier. So that was comment one. I'm wondering, and maybe I'm sure this happens, but I think we need to hear about it, and we need these stories, is at the end of a budget cycle, when you're looking at expenditures that are over budget or not how we thought they'd come in, to be able to analyze and see what part of that was caused by risk we could have mitigated or should have mitigated. Sometimes it's just caused because of, you know, the price of salt went up, or, you know, again, we could have mitigated that, but there's sometimes it's really strong, and I hate to just be reactive here. I know you guys are being so proactive, but that probably should be part of our cycle, that we are reacting to that, and that's good data to be able to show. Last year we spent this much on this issue, and then we took this change, made this change. Training and telling people, let's get to loss control, to drive more carefully or back more carefully or walk carefully on the ice is important. But we know this last year we had 4 falls in this same spot. What if right after the first fall, we, instead of telling people to walk more carefully and they didn't get around to reading that, we blocked it off, we changed something, we did something. There were a lot of lost days, a lot of things that could have happened. Maybe we need to look at those more things that happen and see if we should react in a different way right away and actually save some money, which you're doing all the time, but I think, again, it's getting back down to the front line and the department levels. So that's what I was thinking about during this, and I'm excited next year to see how that happens and changes.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Albright.
I'm thinking of contract risk, and if you went over this, I was working on something, and if I missed it, I apologize, but I want to cite this example specifically. MBTA had a contract with an out-of-state vendor, very expensive contract, over $1 million, and got in a situation where you could say, they could say, we delivered on the contract, and MBTA would have said, no, you didn't deliver on the contract. And it's a very complex situation where they're designing and delivering something unique for them, and sometimes we might have the same situation for us. I can think in the past, I have a vague recollection that we have gotten burned on IT contract in maybe the more distant past. I can think of counties in the region that have gotten burned on IT contracts. What MVT had to do they still needed the solution that they were seeking in the next contract that they did. They actually hired a outside IT expert to help them write the contract, just so they had enough protections and enough deliverable points of, you got to deliver this % before you get these dollars, and it has to be, a lot of protections. Are you going to that length where, I mean, when you say standard contracts, we're using standard contract language, that would just not apply in this highly complex situation. How are you dealing with those kinds of situations where we might be asking them to write something for us specifically and measuring whether it's delivering or not? Do you have that in IT now at all?
In terms of, I think when Jen talks about standard contract language, there are standard templates that we use, or we try to use and force our vendors to use, that apply pretty much to all contracts. Most contracts where there's something customized that we're requesting, we'll attach a statement of work which is unique to that particular piece of work, but the master template is where we have all the standard language that applies across the board. So I think there are cases where it would be beneficial to maybe look at an outside source. Part of it is we don't do a lot of customization of things that we buy. Most of the things we buy are either off the shelf or standard products that are available in the marketplace. So we don't have a lot of those situations where we're asking a vendor for something really customized that only applies to us. We have some smaller ones like interfaces between two systems and things like that that we ask for. Those are a little less, have a little less risk to them versus like if we ask somebody to go build a complete custom payroll system or something like that, that would be a huge risk. So I think that's where we're talking about some of the standard language. And like the MVTA, I'm not familiar with that contract, but I'm guessing that that has a lot more custom information in it that was specific to MVTA. I just don't see that we have a lot of those types of situations here in IT.
Even on the state level, wouldn't you say that the state got burned on a Minlar's contract?
This discussion, I think I wish we could put some risk.
Go ahead. Commissioner, I was going to say, I think that's part of the technology roadmap though as well. We're not building, we're using standard, we're using off the shelf, we're trying to move towards SaaS types. And that's part of that risk management, I think, that Gary's vision is with that. And then as well, in our contracts you mentioned, we do usually have, and Jen could probably speak to it better than I, but we only pay certain points when we hit certain markers or milestones along the way. So we don't pay up front or big chunks up front. It's as things occur, similar to highway projects as they meet certain things. But.
And that's Commissioner Ulrich, that's exactly it. And from my experience, our biggest risk in a contract generally lies in how we write the scope and how we write the payment terms. And so our general insurance, our general indemnification, those are those standard clauses that stay pretty consistent across our contracts. So when we're doing those reviews on a regular basis, those are the pieces that we're really kind of looking for. And if they're not clear, that's when we're going back to Jeff or we're going back to the experts in that area and saying, and again, because it's not necessarily our area of expertise, this doesn't make sense. What are you really trying to say here so that we can be as clear? And Leslie really hit it too on those large contracts, tying payment terms to deliverables. This is what's going to be delivered, and then this is what we're going to pay, and really kind of making sure that we're protected in that sense and not just paying monthly, but paying on those deliverables and making sure there's a process in place for how we accept that deliverable and how we test that deliverable. The IT contracts are a really good example where there's always in those contracts we lay out the testing, we lay out the acceptance and how we're going to do those pieces. So from my perspective, I really see how we write those scopes and how we write those payment terms is where we have the opportunity to really mitigate the risk back to the county.
All right, thank you.
And I was going to add, I think you approved one today in highway. It was a risk issue, right? County Highway 42 that had to be authorized. But if you look at some of the data highway uses, they look at supplemental agreements or change orders. It has been very low. We should be very proud over that over the last, I think, 8 to 10 years. This is one where you had risk with utilities, which caused an issue, which caused a change. And so hopefully learning from that, the communication with that moving forward, to Commissioner Brecky's point, how do we change that and improve that so we don't see it again on a major utility corridor? And so those are great things to utilize and understand.
And we've done something similar with hiring an advisor with the GC2 building project, where hiring Kraus Anderson was a risk mitigation factor, where they are working for us to run the project as opposed to hiring a general contractor, where we have more control over what's happening there with such a high-risk project.
I think another example even that today was with Gallagher, our advisors on our health insurance too, where we seek that outside expertise and to really advise us and provide us information along with what the expertise from our staff to make those really good decisions. And I think that's a really good example of risk assessment that was being done to make a good decision. So.
In addition to Jennifer's, I also just did work on a project for the technology upgrade in Courtroom 6, and that is a project that's between the county and the state, and we also hired a consultant to write the specs and the requirements for that because we just didn't have the knowledge for the IT department or just the county as a general to write that. And so just having that, we're hoping to cover all the requirements and specifications that we're looking at, so we don't have to hopefully incur any more costs throughout the project than maybe what we would have at the beginning.
All right. Good deal. Thank you very much.
For your service.
Nice job.
Very nice.